What if I told you that in 1812, one British general went from liberating Madrid and being hailed as a hero to retreating through freezing rain with his starving army looting Spanish villages, all in the space of 5 months? Wellington's campaign in Spain that year was a roller coaster of brilliant victories and crushing setbacks. And whilst Napoleon was losing 500,000 men in Russia, the fate of the entire Peninsular War was being decided in a single afternoon outside. This is the story of how Wellington turned the tide against the French Empire, then nearly threw it all away. Mine content. Picture Spain in 1812. Napoleon's got 250,000 French troops scattered across the country, absolutely bogged down in what's become a proper nightmare of a war. They're fighting on 3 fronts simultaneously, against Spanish guerrillas, who know every mountain pass and village, against what's left of Spain's regular armies, and against an Anglo-Portuguese force led by Lord Wellington, who's been a thorn in their side for years. The French still control Madrid and most major cities. Mind you, they're not beaten yet. And the year actually kicks off with another massive French victory in the south that looks like it might turn everything around. But here's the thing about the Peninsular War. It had become an absolute graveyard for French military reputations. General Junot, defeated. Marshal Soult, tasted defeat multiple times. Marshal Jourdan, same story. Marshal Massena had been recalled in complete disgrace after Wellington thrashed him. These were some of Napoleon's most famous generals, and Spain was eating them alive. The one exception was Marshal Louis Gabriel Suchet. Now, this chap was different from his colleagues. French generals in Spain were notorious for being corrupt as hell. Soult, based down in Andalusia, was probably the worst. He'd nicked about 1.5 million francs worth of art from Spanish monasteries and churches. Absolute kleptomaniac. But Suchet, governing Aragon, took a completely different approach. He enforced strict discipline on his troops, punishing anyone who tried to steal or extort money from the Spanish. He treated local authorities with actual respect, proper hearts and minds strategy. And when guerrillas attacked, he was absolutely ruthless in response. The combination worked brilliantly, and he established firm control of his region. In June 1811, Suchet captured the port of Tarragona after a particularly brutal assault. Napoleon was so chuffed, he gave him his marshal's baton. Then he sent reinforcements and ordered Suchet to take Valencia. First, Suchet dealt with a much larger Spanish army that attacked him at Saguntum, routing them completely. Then he laid siege to Valencia. The city was packed with Spanish troops and refugees, and when it became clear they'd starve, General Blake surrendered on the 8th of January, 1812. The haul was extraordinary. 18,000 prisoners, including 23 generals and nearly 500 guns. It was a devastating blow to the Spanish cause, absolutely crushing. But here's where Napoleon made a crucial mistake. To reinforce Suchet, he'd stripped troops from other French armies in Spain. Then he withdrew 25,000 of his best soldiers for his upcoming invasion of Russia. The result, French forces in Spain were now dangerously overstretched, spread far too thin across a hostile country, and Wellington, who'd been waiting patiently like a spider in its web, knew it. Spanish guerrillas kept Wellington brilliantly informed about French movements. He was desperate to take the city before Marshal Marmont could march to its relief. So, after just 10 days, he ordered an assault. It succeeded, though it cost 300 lives, including Major General Crowford of the Light Division. Wellington then marched south to besiege Badajoz, a much more heavily defended city. The assault on the night of the 6th of April was absolutely horrific. The first wave attacking the main breach were slaughtered wholesale, but what was supposed to be just a diversionary attack on the castle, using scaling ladders, actually succeeded. The city fell. The storming of Badajoz cost 3,700 British casualties, and what happened afterwards was one of the darkest moments of Wellington's campaigns. Survivors went completely berserk, drinking, looting, raping, and killing over 100 Spanish civilians before British officers finally managed to restore order. Despite the horror, Wellington had secured the two main routes between Spain and Portugal. Now he sent his most reliable subordinate, General Hill, with a small Anglo-Portuguese force to destroy the bridge at Almaraz, over the river Tagus. This bridge was absolutely vital. It linked Marmont's army of Portugal with Soult's army of the south. The next usable bridge was at Toledo, 90 miles east. Losing it would be a massive blow to French logistics. The bridge was well defended by forts and redoubts, but Hill led a swift, daring assault that caught the French completely by surprise. The bridge and all the engineering equipment were burned for the cost of just 177 casualties. Brilliant operation. Wellington was now ready to begin his main advance into Spain. Spanish regular forces and guerrilla bands launched operations across the country to tie down as many French troops as possible. From the Bay of Biscay, British naval forces made diversionary raids on French coastal targets. Everything was coordinated to support Wellington's offensive. In just 4 days, Wellington reached Salamanca. Marmont, outnumbered, withdrew behind the River Douro. But when French reinforcements arrived, he crossed back over, ready to fight. For 6 days, the two armies engaged in an extraordinary dance. Marmont kept trying to march around Wellington's flank, but the British general matched him move for move. The two armies marched in parallel, often within sight of each other. It must have been surreal, thousands of men tramping along, watching their enemies doing exactly the same thing a few miles away. But on the 7th day, Marmont made a catastrophic blunder that would change everything. On the morning of the 22nd of July, Wellington's army occupied high ground about 4 miles south of Now, Here's where Marmont's overconfidence got the better of him. He'd convinced himself that Wellington was overly cautious, that he wouldn't risk an aggressive attack. The hills hid most of Wellington's army from view, and when Marmont saw dust clouds to the west, he assumed it was Wellington's baggage train leaving Salamanca. The British were retreating, except they weren't. Those dust clouds were actually the British 3rd Division and a Portuguese cavalry brigade moving up to strengthen Wellington'S flank. Because Wellington wasn't planning a retreat at all. He was about to attack. Around 2 in the afternoon, Marmont ordered the 5 infantry divisions waiting in the woods to march west and cut off what he thought was Wellington's retreat. General Moncun's division stopped to engage what they presumed was the British rearguard in a village. General Thomir's division continued marching west past them. Wellington watched from his position as the French left flank became increasingly strung out, stretched thin like butter scraped over too much bread. He knew, immediately, this was an opportunity too good to miss. He galloped 3 miles across country to personally give orders to the 3rd Division. Many of his staff officers struggled to keep up with him. When he arrived, he instructed the division's commander, who happened to be his own brother-in-law, Edward Pakenham, to attack and drive everything before him. The 3rd Division's advance was hidden by low hills until the absolute last moment. Thomir's division was caught completely unawares. They were shattered by the assault. Thomir's himself was killed. Half his division killed or captured, the rest scattered and fleeing. At this crucial moment, Marshal Marmont was hit by a British artillery shell and carried from the field with serious wounds. His second-in-command was wounded an hour later. So command passed to General Clausel, who suddenly found himself in charge of a battle that was rapidly falling apart. 45 minutes later, the British 5th Division attacked. Supported by Portuguese brigades and cavalry under General Lamarchand, the French saw the cavalry coming and formed square, the standard defensive formation. But they were hit first by British infantry, who unleashed devastating volleys at close range, then charged with bayonets. The French were routed and run down by Lamarchien's cavalry. It was absolutely brutal. 8 French battalions were destroyed, and 2 Eagles captured. Lamarchand himself was shot from his saddle, but his brigade had done tremendous damage. Wellington's attack continued in echelon, wave after wave. Cole's 4th Division advanced in the center, but Pack's Portuguese brigade was thrown back from the Greater Arapol, and the whole division soon fell back in disorder. It wasn't all going Wellington's way, despite the devastation of his army's left flank. General Clausel decided to launch a desperate counterattack on the Lesser Arap, which was the hinge of Wellington's entire position. If he could take it, he might still snatch victory from disaster. But the French advance was met by fresh troops who poured devastating volleys of musket fire into the French columns. They began falling back. The French army had lost the will to fight, soldiers streaming away into the woods. General Ferry's division mounted a brave rearguard action to buy time for the army to escape. But it was hopeless. They were soon outflanked, and Ferry himself was killed. Only one French division escaped in good order. With darkness falling and his army exhausted, Wellington called off the pursuit. He'd absolutely smashed Marmont's army. 7,000 prisoners taken. 6,000 killed or wounded. A French casualty rate of 25%, more than double Wellington's own losses. It was a crushing victory. The next day, German cavalry achieved the almost unheard-of feat of charging down a French infantry square and taking another 1,000 prisoners. Wellington now decided to march on Madrid, forcing King Joseph to abandon the capital and retreat to Valencia. On the 12th of August, Wellington liberated the city to scenes of absolute wild celebration. After years of French occupation, Madrid was free. Soult, down in Andalusia, now risked being cut off. He abandoned the siege of Cadiz, which had dragged on for 2.5 years, and marched east to join Joseph. The following month, Wellington marched north, pushing the French back and besieging Burgos Castle, but his army lacked heavy siege guns, and the French garrison fought bravely. Meanwhile, powerful French armies were gathering to the north and south. Wellington himself was now in danger of being trapped. He had no choice but to withdraw. What followed was one of the most miserable retreats in British military history. Wellington's army made a desperate forced march through autumn rain. The supply system completely collapsed. Starving soldiers looted whatever food they could find from Spanish villages. The very people they'd come to liberate were now suffering at their hands. Madrid was abandoned and reoccupied by the French on the 1st of November. Wellington was back where he'd started 5 months before. Closing. So what do we make of 1812? On the surface, Wellington's campaign ended pretty much where it began, with the French back in Madrid and his army battered and demoralized. You might think it was all for nothing, but you'd be wrong. Despite the campaign's dismal conclusion, Wellington's strike into Spain had liberated huge swaths of the country. The French were now more overstretched than ever, their forces scattered, trying to control a hostile population and defend against both regulars and guerrillas. Wellington would be back the next year, reinforced and ready to deliver the final blow to Joseph's Spanish kingdom. And this time, there'd be no retreat. 1812 was the year the tide truly turned in the Peninsular War. Wellington had proved at Salamanca that he could not only defend, but attack brilliantly, destroying a French army in the field through superior tactics and split-second decision-making. And whilst we often focus on Napoleon's catastrophic invasion of Russia that year, where 500,000 men perished in the snow, we shouldn't forget that 2,000 miles to the west, another disaster was unfolding for the French Empire. Spain was bleeding France dry, and Wellington was the surgeon with the scalpel. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the most dramatic campaigns of the Napoleonic Wars, share it with anyone who loves military history with all its ups and downs, victories and disasters. Drop a comment telling us which aspect of Wellington's campaigns you'd like us to explore next. And remember, in war, brilliant victories and crushing defeats can be separated by just a few months, or sometimes just a few hours. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and never underestimate the importance of good intelligence and seizing the moment when your enemy makes a mistake. Cheers.